everything around you is soaked. The ground squelches under your boots. The wood is black with water. Your matches are useless. Your lighter is fighting a losing battle, and the temperature is dropping fast. This is the exact moment where most people die in the wilderness. Not from lack of food, not from lack of water, from hypothermia, because they couldn't get a fire going when it mattered most. But here's the thing nobody tells you. There is one technique, used by survival instructors and old-school bushcrafters for generations, that works even when every single thing around you is dripping wet. It doesn't need dry weather. It doesn't need a magic fire starter you bought online. It just needs you to know where to look and what to do with what you find. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly how to do it, step by step. So if you're ever standing in a downpour with your life depending on a flame, you won't panic. You'll know. Let's get into it. So first, let's talk about why wet weather fires fail in the first place, because understanding the problem is half the battle. Fire needs three things: heat, fuel, and oxygen. That's the classic fire triangle they teach you in every basic course. But when everything's wet, there's a fourth invisible enemy sitting right on top of your fuel, and that's water. Water doesn't just sit there being annoying. It actively steals your heat. When you apply a flame to wet wood, most of that heat energy doesn't go into combustion. It goes into evaporating the water first. So your little lighter flame or your one match is basically wasting almost all of its energy just trying to boil off moisture before it can even think about igniting the wood underneath. That's why people burn through an entire box of matches in the rain and still end up with nothing but a wet, smoking mess and cold hands. So the real skill in wet weather isn't lighting a fire. It's finding fuel that was never actually wet in the first place. That's the mindset shift. You're not trying to dry out wet wood with your flame. You're hunting for wood that skipped the wet part entirely. And that wood exists, even in a swamp, even after 3 days of non-stop rain. You just have to know where to look. Here's mistake number one that almost everybody makes, and it's the reason so many people fail before they even start. They look down. The second it starts raining, human instinct is to grab whatever's on the ground, because it's right there, it's easy, it's convenient. But the ground is exactly where you should not be looking. Ground debris has been sitting in puddles, soaking up moisture from the soil underneath for hours or days. Even if it looks dry on the surface, the second you snap it, you'll find it's damp and spongy on the inside. That wood is dead to you, literally and figuratively. Instead, the very first thing a real bushcrafter does when it's wet is look up, not down, up and around, at eye level and above. You're hunting for what's called standing deadwood. These are dead branches that are still attached to a living or dead tree, hanging in the air instead of lying in the mud. And this is the golden rule of wet weather firecraft. Wood that never touches the ground stays dry, or dries out fast, because gravity sheds the rain off it and wind gets to circulate around it. A dead branch snapped off a tree, still hanging up in the canopy, has been getting blasted by wind for weeks, which pulls moisture out of it even while rain is falling somewhere else on the forest. Here's a pro tip that separates people who know what they're doing from people who are just guessing. When you find a candidate branch, don't just eyeball it, snap it. A genuinely dry, usable piece of dead wood will snap with a clean, crisp crack, almost like breaking a dry cracker. If it bends, if it feels rubbery, or if it makes a dull thud instead of a snap, that wood is still holding moisture inside, and you need to keep moving and try another one. This single test, the snap test, will save you more time and frustration than almost anything else in this video. Get in the habit of snapping every stick before you commit to collecting it. And where exactly should you be aiming your search? Coniferous trees are your best friend here. Pines, firs, spruces. These trees naturally shed their lower branches as they grow taller, and those dead lower limbs are often shielded by the living canopy above them, like a natural umbrella that's been protecting them from direct rain for who knows how long. So walk up to a big pine or fir, look at the lower dead branches close to the trunk, and snap a few. Chances are high you're going to find something usable, even in a full-blown storm. There's also something called a snag, which is a dead tree that's still standing and rooted in the ground, as opposed to a fallen log. Snags are gold mines in wet weather because the wood inside them has been drying and curing for potentially years, protected from ground moisture the entire time. And if you see what's called a widowmaker, which is a large dead branch caught up in the canopy of another tree, that can also be a great source of dry wood, but be extremely careful retrieving those, because as the name suggests, they can fall without warning. Never yank on one directly beneath it, Approach from the side if you have to pull on it at all. Okay, so now you've found some standing deadwood. You've done the snap test, and it feels promising. But here's where a lot of people still mess it up, and this is critical. Even good standing deadwood usually has a wet or damp outer layer, especially the bark and the very outside surface, because rain has still been hitting it directly. The magic isn't on the outside, it's on the inside. This is where we get to the real secret weapon of wet weather firecraft, the feather stick. A feather stick, sometimes called a fuzz stick, is one of the single most important skills in all of bushcraft. And honestly, if you only remember one thing from this entire video, remember this technique, because it will save your life one day if you're ever caught out in bad weather. Here's exactly how you make one. First, take your piece of standing deadwood and split it open with your knife, or a small hatchet if you have one. You want to get past that damp outer bark and expose the dry heartwood underneath, which has been protected from the rain the entire time it was inside that branch. This is the core principle of the whole technique. Rain is not fast enough or powerful enough to soak all the way through a solid piece of wood in the time it's been raining. The center stays dry far longer than the surface. So by splitting it open, you're essentially unlocking a completely dry fire-starting resource that was hiding in plain sight the whole time, disguised as a wet stick. Once you've split it, and you can see that lighter, drier wood in the center, now comes the actual feathering. Take your knife, and holding the stick firmly, angle your blade at a shallow angle along the grain of the wood, almost parallel to the surface, and push the blade down the length of the stick in a slow, controlled motion. You're not trying to cut all the way through. You're trying to peel up a thin curl of wood that stays attached at the base, like a ribbon that's still connected to the stick. Do this again, just slightly rotated or slightly deeper, and do it again, and again, working your way around and down the stick. What you end up with looks exactly like its name suggests, a stick covered in delicate curls of wood that genuinely resemble feathers. Why does this work so incredibly well? Because you've just multiplied the surface area of that wood dramatically. A solid stick is hard to ignite because fire has to work its way in from the outside, slowly, fighting against the density of the wood. But paper-thin curls catch a flame almost instantly, the same way a single sheet of paper catches faster than an entire phone book. Those curls are your kindling, your very first stage of the fire, the bridge between a tiny flame from your lighter, or ferro rod, and a fire that can actually sustain itself and eventually take on thicker fuel. A few more tips to make your feather sticks as good as possible, because quality matters enormously here. Use the sharpest knife you have. This is not the moment for a dull blade. A dull or serrated knife will tear and crumble the wood instead of producing clean curls. And trust me, you'll feel the difference immediately. It's like night and day. If you're serious about bushcraft, a knife with a Scandi grind or a convex grind is ideal for this kind of work, because the edge geometry is built for controlled shallow cuts exactly like this. Second, go for thin curls, not thick ones. It's tempting to rush and take big chunky shavings because it feels faster, but thin, almost translucent curls catch fire far more easily and burn hotter as a group. Third, make as many as you possibly can on one stick. Don't stop at a handful. The bushier and fuller that feather stick looks, almost like a genuine bird's feather duster, the better your odds of getting a sustained flame on the very first try, which matters enormously when your hands are cold and your matches are limited. Now let's talk about an even more powerful trick, one that most beginners have never even heard of, and it is an absolute game changer in wet weather. It's called fat wood, sometimes called pitch wood or lighter wood. And once you know how to find it, wet weather stops being scary at all. Fat wood forms in certain coniferous trees, especially pine, when the tree is dying or after it's died. As the tree's life process is shut down, resin retreats and concentrates into the heartwood, particularly around the base of branches and inside old stumps. That resin-soaked wood becomes incredibly dense with natural flammable oils, and because it's so saturated with resin, it fundamentally does not absorb water the way normal wood does. This means fat wood can be sitting in a literal puddle, soaking wet on the outside, and the moment you cut into it or split it, the inside is just as flammable as if it had never seen a drop of rain. It is, without exaggeration, considered the holy grail of natural fire starters by pretty much every serious bushcrafter and survival instructor out there. So how do you find fat wood in the field? Start by looking at old pine stumps, especially ones that look weathered, grayish, and clearly been dead a long time. The wood at the very core of that stump has often been curing in resin for years, You'll also want to check the spots where branches meet the trunk on dead pine trees, because resin concentrates heavily right at those junction points. And here's a sensory trick that works even better than looking. Smell it. When you cut or split into real fatwood, you will get hit with a strong, unmistakable pine scent, almost sweet and syrupy. That smell is basically nature confirming for you, out loud, that you've struck gold. If you cut into a stump and there's no smell, keep digging. You probably haven't hit the resin-soaked core yet. Once you've found a chunk of fatwood, you don't even need to feather it necessarily, though feathering it makes it even more effective. You can shave off small curls or even just carve off tiny slivers with your knife, and these ignite almost instantly, even from a single spark off a ferro rod. In fact, fatwood is so reliable that a lot of experienced woodsmen carry a small stash of it in a waterproof container specifically for emergencies, because it genuinely doesn't matter how wet the world around you is. That little piece of resin-soaked wood is going to light. Now let's talk about your ignition source, because finding great fuel means nothing if you can't actually get a flame onto it. In wet weather, a standard butane lighter can struggle, especially if it's gotten damp or if there's wind whipping around, which there often is during a storm. This is why most serious bushcrafters carry a ferro rod, sometimes called a ferrocerium rod, as their primary or backup fire starter. A ferro rod works by scraping a metal striker against a rod made of a special alloy, throwing off sparks that burn at an extremely high temperature, several thousand degrees. Unlike a lighter, a ferro rod doesn't care if it's wet. You can literally dunk it in a puddle, shake it off, and it will still throw a shower of hot sparks. That's an enormous advantage when everything else in your kit might be struggling with moisture. To use a ferro rod effectively on your feather stick or fatwood shavings, hold the rod close to your tinder, almost touching it, and pull the striker back toward yourself in one confident, fast motion, rather than pushing the rod away from the tinder, which tends to scatter your sparks off target. You want those sparks landing directly onto the thinnest, fluffiest part of your feather stick or fatwood shavings. It might take 2 or 3 strikes to get a spark to actually catch and hold, especially in windy or wet conditions. So don't panic if the first attempt doesn't work. Just keep your tinder positioned and try again. Alright, so now you've got your dry standing deadwood. You've made a proper feather stick. Maybe you've supplemented it with some fatwood shavings, and you've got sparks landing where they need to. But there's one more massive factor that trips people up in wet weather, and it has nothing to do with the wood itself. It's the ground. Here's the problem. Even if every single piece of wood you're using is perfectly dry, if you build your fire directly on soaked earth, moisture wicks upward into your fire from underneath, stealing heat exactly the way we talked about earlier, and often extinguishing a fragile new flame before it ever gets the chance to establish itself. It's genuinely like trying to stay dry while standing in a swimming pool. Doesn't matter how good your umbrella is if the water's coming from below. The solution is something experienced bushcrafters call a fire platform, or sometimes a fire raft. Before you even strike your first spark, take a few minutes to build this, because it will make or break your entire effort. Find several relatively straight logs, ideally a bit thicker than your wrist, and lay them down parallel to each other on the ground, side by side, like you're building a tiny wooden raft or a mini deck. Interestingly, you actually want to use green living wood for this base layer rather than dead dry wood, because green wood resists burning through too quickly. It just needs to act as a barrier, not as fuel, so it can be a little damp itself. That's fine. Its whole job is separation from the wet ground, not combustion. Once that platform is down, that's where you build everything else. Place your tinder, your feather sticks, your fatwood shavings, right on top of that platform, elevated above the wet ground, catching air circulation from underneath instead of soaking up moisture. This single step, building a platform first, is one of the most overlooked parts of wet weather firecraft. And it's honestly the difference between a fire that catches and holds versus a fire that flickers pathetically for 30 seconds and dies. Let's also quickly talk about your fire lay, meaning the actual shape and structure you build once you're past the tinder stage and moving into kindling and fuel wood. In wet weather, a tight teepee shape or a small dense structure tends to work best initially, because it concentrates heat inward and helps everything dry out and ignite together, rather than heat escaping in every direction. Start with your feather sticks and fatwood shavings as the very core. Around that, lean small pencil-thin pieces of the dry heartwood you split earlier, again from standing deadwood, forming a loose cone shape. As that catches and grows, you can start feeding in slightly thicker pieces, always favoring wood you've split open to expose the dry interior rather than whole wet branches straight off the ground. Only once you have a solid established flame, one that's really roaring and self-sustaining, should you start introducing larger, less processed fuel, because by that point your fire is finally hot enough to burn off the surface moisture on its own without your help. One more thing worth mentioning, because it genuinely matters: shelter first, fire second, when it's actively raining hard. If rain is coming down directly onto your fire building area, even the best technique in the world is fighting an uphill battle. Rig up some kind of overhead cover if you can, whether that's a poncho stretched between branches, a tarp, or even just positioning yourself under a dense tree canopy that's blocking most of the direct rainfall. You don't need a mansion, you just need to stop water from landing directly on your tinder while you're building it. Even a few minutes of relative dryness overhead dramatically increases your odds of success. Let's do a quick recap, because there's a lot of information here. And if you're ever in a real situation, you want this sequence locked into muscle memory, not scattered pieces you're trying to remember under pressure. Step 1. Stop looking at the ground. Look up and around at eye level for standing deadwood, dead branches still attached to trees, especially low branches on pines and firs, or dead standing snags. Step 2. Snap test everything before you commit. A crisp, clean snap means dry inside. A bendy or dull sound means keep moving. Step 3. Split your wood open with your knife to expose the dry heartwood hiding underneath that damp outer layer. Step 4. Make a feather stick from that dry core, thin curls, sharp knife, shallow angle, as many curls as you can manage. Step 5. Hunt for fatwood if you can find it, checking old pine stumps and branch junctions, using that unmistakable resin smell as your confirmation. Step 6. Use a ferro rod as your ignition source if you have one, since it performs reliably even when wet, striking sparks directly onto your thinnest tinder. Step 7. Build a fire platform first using parallel green logs to lift everything off the soaked ground before you even strike a spark. Step 8. Build a tight teepee structure around your feather sticks and fatwood, and only add thicker fuel once you have a genuinely established, self-sustaining flame. That's the entire technique, and I want you to notice something about it. None of this requires a single piece of expensive gear. No chemical fire starters, no waterproof match tins, none of that. Every single step in this method uses only a knife and knowledge, which honestly is the entire philosophy of bushcraft. Gear can fail, gear can get lost, gear can run out, but once you actually understand why wood behaves the way it does in the rain, and where to find the dry stuff hiding in plain sight, that knowledge never runs out on you. It's in your head permanently, ready whenever you need it. And that's really the point of a video like this. It's not really about camping tips or weekend hobby content. It's about the fact that fire has been the single difference between life and death for human beings for hundreds of thousands of years, and even now, with all our modern gear and technology, that fundamental truth hasn't changed one bit. If you're ever stuck out there cold, soaked, and running low on options, the knowledge in this video could genuinely be what gets you through the night. If this helped you out, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making content like this. Subscribe if you want more real, practical bushcraft and survival skills, not fluff, not filler, just the stuff that actually works when it counts. And let me know down in the comments, have you ever had to start a fire in genuinely miserable soaked conditions? What worked for you, what didn't? I read every comment, and honestly, some of the best tips I've ever learned came from people sharing their own field experience down there. Stay dry out there if you can. And if you can't, now you know exactly what to do. I'll see you in the next one.